Now, have you ever had a feeling like the world is spinning off its axis, but you can't exactly put your finger on why? That the people in charge really, well, don't know what they're doing? And that instead of offering solutions, they'd rather stop you from talking about what's wrong? Well, guess what? You're not alone. I'm really thrilled to bring you my next guest, Martin Gurri. He's a former CIA analyst and author of The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. He's a visiting fellow at George Mason University and a regular contributor to Discourse magazine, where he recently wrote a brilliant piece called The World Before the Thaw, talking about the crisis in democracies and their push to authoritarianism. Martin Gurri, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us, and I've been wanting to get you on since I read this piece in Discourses. You talk in this article about the ghost of Marxism in China and Putin's gangsterism, but then you make this point. We might expect the democrat nations, you say, to proportionately thrive as authoritarianism declines into unreality, yet this hasn't happened. Martin Gurri, explain why and how this phenomenon is manifesting itself.
Yeah, it's like a race to unreality. We're beating the Chinese and the Russians in our own attempts to escape from what seems to be the real world to most people. It's really an old story, the loss of trust in the elites. It just became catastrophic maybe around the turn of the century with the internet, the digital revolution, because as you say, suddenly we're able to see every mistake that they make, that the elites make. We're able to catch every silly word that they utter. We're able to find out about their little sexual escapades. We realize that these people who in the 20th century had been admired and imitated were really quite contemptible and incompetent. The elites took actually quite a long time to realize this. It took Trump and it took Brexit for it to happen. It had been happening for quite a while before then. And they now have a cure. They have a cure to put them back into the 20th century. And that is basically they declare a crisis over anything that they feel they're going to meet any opposition on, say the pandemic, say the climate, say any number of disinformation is a famous one. No time to dawdle in debate. Sorry. Too much of a hurry. It's morally negligent not to act now. Yes, we can't even debate in Congress or in Parliament. It has to be a mandate from the executive, and here it is. And this seems to be it's a playbook that seems to be followed again and again and again. At every step of the way, of course, the elites have more arbitrary authority, but at the same time, they have less legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
Yeah, and that anger at the elites, that realization that the system is rigged and being run by people who really, as you say, don't know what they're doing, that erupts periodically, and from time to time we've seen it in the U.S., we see it in France all the time. But one thing I think was really interesting, though, is how during the pandemic you had some uprisings, such as Black Lives Matter in the U.S., were totally allowed, and then you had others, any anti-lockdown protests or anything like that, anti-vaccine protests, whatever, these were all shut down. So is it that there are some ways that the elite like to channel the rage of people to create their own outcomes?
I think what they do is they co-opt certain let's say, pseudo-ideologies, certain points of frustration. And identity is one that they have very much co-opted. I mean, if you are the upper crust in the city that I live in, Washington, D.C., you don't have problems with identity. No matter what color you are a powerful person, right? But there's always a sense of, there must be grievance, there must be equity. And when you think about it, if you start thinking in terms of group rights versus individual rights, and more or less mandating that all groups must somehow be proportionate in every transaction, that makes the government the referee in every transaction in society. So that gives it an enormous amount of power. Some of the other, the January 6th in this country, 2021, the indignados in Spain, the yellow vests in France, those were literally aimed at the government, the sitting government. There was no way those could be co-opted. There were just explosions of rage with very little thought or coherent demands behind them. Just basically saying, we
Hmm.
hate you and we wish you would go away. And we wish all the institutions in which you stand could be battered to dust.
And, you talk about how the elites use existential crisis, and it kind of keeps everybody in a constant state of panic, whether it's climate or race or this or that. And here in Australia, we have a misinformation bill that our Labor government is trying to push through, which is really, really Orwellian. It would create different classes of people who are allowed to say different things. The government, of course, is never guilty of misinformation explicitly in the law. How does this management of the information ecosystem then, allow them to drive people who they don't want to have a voice out of the legitimate square of debate?
Well, disinformation was something I dealt with a lot inside the agency. It's in the context in which it's being used today, it has a very simple meaning. It means shut up, peasant. It just means it means I don't like what I'm hearing from you. It's this information. I'm going to shut you down. The elites, certainly in my country, and I think all the democracies, honestly, they want their 20th century back. The 20th century institutions were very hierarchical. The information system structure was very tightly controllable, and therefore mistakes were obscured. Corruption was conducted very discreetly, and everybody admired you for who you were, because when you stood on television and gave a speech, if you were Walter Cronkite, if you were JFK, nobody thought about your private lives or anything like that. They just saw an image that had authority and conveyed information. Today's the exact opposite. If you are president, the minute you're elected, everybody distrusts you just for being president.
And finally, Martin, where is the way out of this? Is there a new sort of ideology or new sort of thought process in the offing, that could wind up supplementing the current elite regime, or just fixing this crisis of legitimacy in the West? Because otherwise it seems like it's just competing authoritarianisms.
Yeah, I mean, authoritarian is a hard word. I would say we're headed by little steps that way. We are in the grip, or the elites are in the grip, I would say, of a pseudo-ideology of control. They plug in all these pseudo because it doesn't make sense, it doesn't cohere. So it's just different things like the climate and race and pandemic, and these things don't necessarily cohere together, except in the end, it's the rule of experts, the rule of science, the rule of justice, as defined by the people in charge, right? So you need something to beat that something, right? You can't beat something with nothing. Part of the problem with the protests has been that they're hollow ideologically, and you will not. We're in a very unimaginative moment in history. You're not going to change this. You're not going to beat a pseudo ideology of control until you work out an ideology of freedom.
Martin Gurri, thank you so much. Read his stuff on Discourse Magazine and elsewhere.